And thank you for putting you on the spot your first time around. All right, so the moment we've been all waiting for, we have a great presentation ahead for you. Many of you probably know Justin Leader. He has been connected to SHRM for many years. I'm not sure how many, but locally here, he's presented to us in the past. He also is part of state council and does a lot of great things with the annual event and so forth. So Justin, in August of 2014, and before I continue, I'm sorry, Michelle Hill-Nesbitt wanted to be here and wanted to do these introductions. So I got this last minute because she had an urgent matter she had to take care of. So I'm sorry if I have to read here. I didn't have time to practice before. So Justin formed Benefits DNA in August of 2014, an independent, privately owned health and welfare consulting practice comprising industry experts. He and his partners serve employers, large and small, regarding competitive self-funded healthcare and innovative employee benefit plan design. As a certified health Rosetta Chartered advisor, he and his team are recognized as driving force in fixing many of the issues we currently have in the U.S. healthcare system. In July of 2020, Justin entered as a partner in a joint venture called Highlight Health. Between the combined work with Benefits DNA and Highlight Health, Justin is determined, along with his partners, to fix some of the largest issues plaguing the U.S. healthcare system. He also serves on the PA State Council of SHRM and joined his first board here at York SHRM back in 2013. So there, he dated himself. He and his wife Kim live in Elizabethtown with their toddler Cullen and a baby due on June 3rd. Tell her to hold out till June 19th. That's what I said.
I don't know how she'll feel about that.
I said that. So with Justin, we also have Julie, who traveled a little ways to come see us and spend time with us. She is senior counsel at Berger Monte, I'm so sorry, and a member of the firm's employee benefits and ERISA practice group, where she represents the interest of employees, retirees, plan sponsors, plan participants, and beneficiaries in employee benefit and ERISA cases in the district court and on appeal. Her practice is focused on healthcare, where she brings more than a decade of insurance coverage experience to good use, focusing on the behaviors of insurance carrier TPAs that exercise fiduciary duties under ERISA-covered health plans and counseling employers and other plan sponsors on provisions in their administrative service agreements that might cause them to unwittingly violate ERISA or other employee benefit laws. She is also focused on other legal violations related to patient health care under various federal statutes and state consumer statutes to help everyday Americans bring down the out-of-control healthcare costs they face. Woo-hoo. I can't wait for that. She's an accomplished writer and has written numerous legal and non-legal articles and blog posts. She also has contributed to ERISA litigation textbooks and cumulative supplements and written materials for use in healthcare litigation conferences. So that is super exciting. We've got very qualified individuals for you today. I hope you enjoy. And like I said, we look forward to question and answer at the end and then carrying the conversation a little bit afterward if interested. Justin?
Christy, thank you. Thank you very much. It feels like I'm coming home. This is exciting. So listen, I appreciate the opportunity to come out here. Hopefully it's educational. We're going to have a little bit of fun today. Anybody that's seen me speak before, and I told Julie about this, we have Josh Spivak in the audience who has some lottery tickets. So we're going to do some pop quizzes throughout to keep you awake. You may win $20,000 or you may win nothing at all. But really, I'm super excited to have Julie here. I've had the honor of getting to know Julie over the past year or so in the work that she's done in consumer protections and helping employers as well as individuals navigate this really convoluted system. So my big disclaimer for today, there's no single entity that's nefarious. When it comes to the US healthcare system, we've just built this machine that continues to produce and produce and produce. And now we're getting less and less and less. We're paying more and more and more. So we'll hop in and keep it kind of an open dialogue. If you start snoozing, throw a shoe at me, that's fair, you're allowed. She will sue you if you throw a shoe. Using the force, Brian.
You don't have to point it at it. Try again.
Boom. So quick show of hands. How many employers do we have in here? Or representatives employers? Any attorneys? Raise your hand.
It's okay, there's two of us.
Any providers? And no hospitals? Any insurance carriers or third-party administrators? Oh, we can have so much fun. Yeah, all that stuff. No PBMs, right? Pharmacy benefit manager. Okay, all right. We're in company. We're friends. Quick, you're an ERISA attorney, correct? First pop quiz of the day. Let's think back to our SHRM SCP, SHRM CP, or as far back as what, PHR, SPHR. What does ERISA stand for? No takers? Brian in the back. Give that man a lottery ticket. And what year did that pass? Does anybody remember? Brian, you're not allowed to, you've been dealing in fiduciary responsibility for a long time. You're out. 1974. So over the past, 50 odd years, this is one of the biggest changes that has impacted health and welfare benefits since the passage of ERISA, the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Has anybody heard of the CAA? Ollie Kyle.
A webinar that I was late to and so I don't know much about it.
So welcome. The CAA, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, was really introduced with the intent of improving transparency, ensuring regulatory awareness, minimizing liability, reducing costs, improving plan for employees. I got that, Brian. I'll repeat what they say in the audience. And then there's legislation surrounding this, which helps to push this dialogue of us understanding what it is that we're paying for and what we're getting in healthcare. So I recently bought a vehicle. I finally got rid of the 2011 Hyundai Elantra that I was driving. And when I went to the dealership, they were running a promotion. But we get used to, in healthcare, purchasing things on this impetus of we're getting a discount, but we don't know what the starting price is. So they sell me a vehicle and I don't know what the starting price is. It doesn't matter if they're giving me 50% off. Am I really getting a good deal at the end of the day? So that's just one example of the many layers of the healthcare system that they're now trying to unpack in these laws. So Julie, would you mind touching on those three laws?
Sure. So there's several laws passed over the past 3 or 4 years that are all, when put together, are going to operate to provide more transparency. So on their faces, each one alone doesn't do very much. But once you put them all together, all of a sudden you can start to get information that historically we've not been able to get. Things like claims data about your own employees, things like the hospital price transparency laws, force hospitals to put their negotiated prices on their website and the prices they negotiate with each carrier, their self-pay prices and their Medicare prices. So then the Consolidated Appropriations Act also requires gag clauses to be removed and the CPA to inform you what the discount that they've negotiated with the network is. You can now compare those two prices against each other because you've got two competing laws. There's also the No Surprises Act, transparency and coverage. All of these laws put together require the service providers to health plans to start sharing the information that has historically been considered proprietary and confidential with people buying the plans, which makes a lot of sense because I can't think of any other area where you pay so much money for something as an employer and as an employee, but you don't know until the end how much it's going to cost. And even when you do know, it doesn't always stay that way. And you might get a different bill a year later that says, oh, we've made a mistake. Now, will all of those things change because of these laws? Not yet, but this is an opening into more transparency and into getting more control over what you spend on your own cost with employees.
Have any advisors or any of your vendors approached you about the changes in any of these laws and some of the responsibilities that you have as an employer or plan fiduciary? It's okay if you say no. Most are avoiding the conversation, to be honest with you. There's a lot of responsibilities, and our good friend Julie here has put together a cheat sheet, a timeline of responsibilities that are the requirements of every plan sponsor. So if you're interested in that, we can get that to you later on. I could just hit the button.
I'm just gonna throw it.
It's okay.
All right, good.
Good.
Try it again.
So fiduciary responsibilities. With the CAA, we're looking at the, there we go. Removal of this thing called gag clauses. Direct and indirect compensation disclosures. New reporting requirements for you as employers. And then mental health and substance abuse parity. From a gag clause perspective, has anybody reviewed their insurance contract, whether it be with Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, Cigna, United Healthcare, that's really like the only remaining insurers outside of the regional players, or their TPA agreement or their PBM agreement? Most of them contain gag clauses. And we weren't able to add it to the slide, but once again, our good friend Julie put together a whole list of fun gag clauses that we found in, what was this, 10 different administrative services
Just
agreements?
two.
Oh, that was in two?
That was only in two different.
So 10 gag clauses in 2 administrative service agreements. So what is a gag clause? A gag clause prevents you from being able to access things that you have a right to see and review. Now, you would be able to speak to the HIPAA portion of this, but to be a prudent fiduciary, you have to understand exactly what when it comes to your data.
You can only pay reasonable costs under ERISA or any debt. And so up until now, employers have no way, plan sponsors have no way of knowing whether the costs are paid are reasonable or not, because you have these gag clauses that prevent you from accessing your own claims data in many cases. A lot of the gag clauses don't allow you to audit your own claims. They say, no, you have to do, a limited number per year. You have to set it up in advance. If you want a vendor to look at it, they have to sign a separate agreement with us, or when it's at our discretion whether we allow that or not. So those are the types of roadblocks to checking your own plan and seeing what your costs are that have existed up until now. Now that they have to be removed, and they had to have been removed, by the way, by December 27th, 2021. So if anyone is entering into extending or entering into a new contract after December 27th, 2021, they should already be removed. And if they're not, you are well within your rights to call your TPA, your carrier, and say, hey, I just learned that, we didn't change and remove gag clauses, or I want to make sure they are removed because I have to attest at the end of the year to the DOL that has happened. So the gag clauses have kept you from getting data, from getting your own claims data, from speaking with a provider. If you wanted to call a doctor on your own and see if something could be negotiable, if you wanted to use a different vendor to try and do cost containment after the fact, because the CPA has chosen not to go after something or isn't doing something you want them to do, any of those types of things, gag clauses, they used to prevent you from getting that data. And then, or you theoretically, you can have, let's put it that way.
And historically, the dialogue has gone, well, I'm fully insured, I'm small group, I can't have access to my data, or I'm level funded, maybe tiptoeing into one of the 31 flavors of self-funding, or I'm self-funded. It's this constant battle to understand my data. In some of the work that we've been doing on the Highlight Health side, we've uncovered some pretty substantial discrepancies in what is guaranteed from a discount perspective and what is actually being paid. So as you peel back the layers or pull back the curtain of Oz, it's kind of interesting what we're finding, but this is all a massive effort to increase transparency and hopefully bring down the costs in healthcare. So as Julie had said, gag clauses have historically prevented you from accessing your data. In order to provide the necessary reporting, you need increased access to information regarding cost, quality, and utilization. And then another goal of this provision is to provide enrollees with access to make informed, cost-effective healthcare decisions, which there's 2 ways to really manipulate a health and welfare plan. You can either fund it or you can fix the issues that result in some of the the rising healthcare costs, us as an industry as a whole has tried to change the funding mechanism. So we've manipulated co-pays, we've manipulated deductibles. We introduced this thing called a high deductible health plan and the promise that this is going to breed consumerism. And that hasn't been the case in most populations, especially when you have many deductibles that are over $2,000. And the average savings for most of middle America is less than $1,000. So most folks are walking around functionally uninsured. So it's really created a systemic issue. My next question, what does the DOL stand for? Jen Raschke, I saw you say, Josh, if you could give Jen. Yeah, thank you, sir. You were my guest. We're on the same page. We're spending a lot of time together. So under the DOL is EBSA, EBSA. Does anybody know what EBSA stands for? It's on the tip of your tongue.
The first two.
Okay. Employee Benefit Security Administration. And the team at Bergamonte, they have a lot of ties to the DOL and EBSA. And they are gearing up to enforce all of these rules.
So if you see at the bottom, so what, now what, which is a quote by the great over there. This is a good thing and a bad thing if you're an employer or a plan sponsor. It's great that all of a sudden you are being provided with these tools to be able to actually look at your own data. And gag clauses are being removed. There's other things we're going to talk about. But what does that mean? So why is this happening? Well, the DOL and now is expecting plan sponsors to use this data to get it and to use it to make informed decisions. One of the problems with enforcement that EBSA has had up until now under health plans has been going to employers, trying to say, going to plan sponsors and say, this isn't working, or we have a problem with this, it's a problem with your plan, and a plan sponsor saying, well, I don't know what to tell you, I can't access that information. I've asked my TPA or I've asked the carrier and they won't provide it to me. So what the DOL has decided to do, instead of going after, independent fiduciaries or CPAs that have fiduciary authority, they're going to give the employer the tools that they presumably need to do the reasonable review, and then expect you to do it, because if not, they've elevated, excessive fees and hidden fees in health plans as one of their enforced areas of targeted enforcement. That is going to be one of the areas they look at, right? Their mental health. So it's not just making sure that the gag clauses are removed from your, your contracts and your ASOs, but then making sure that because they're removed, you request the data that lets you evaluate whether or not you're getting a value service. Because if you're not, then you have to make some hard decisions, make some changes, and that opens up. That's a whole new set of negotiations, but this is something that hasn't been able to do before. Yeah.
Quick question on the data access. Are they able to charge you for that?
Thus far, we've noticed a trend towards them monetizing everything. No, I hate to say this, but this is like, there's going to be a lot of issues that are going to have to be litigated at a certain point before we can know for sure. Until then, I would anticipate that they will try and charge for this. So when you're renegotiating your ASOs, you can try and negotiate that upfront and say, I don't intend to pay for my own data. And one of the provisions, by the way, of accessing the data is that they provide electronic access. So there shouldn't be a charge for that, because why would that cost money? So the best way to deal with that is to put it off as a pass and negotiate it up front, because if you don't, they're definitely going to monetize it.
And for those at home, the question was, will the vendors or covered service providers, which we'll discuss what that is, are they charging for access to the data? And the answer is yes, some are. So most recently, we have a 1,700 member labor union, and the third party administrator is catching up to fulfill the obligations of the Mental Health Parity Act for a portion of this. And they want to add in an additional $1.50 per member per month to be able to provide this, which is really quite silly at the end of the day.
Considering it's something that should already
They should already be doing,
yeah.
Right? So the implications of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, covered service providers must disclose direct and indirect compensation if above $1,000 received during the term of the contract to a responsible plan fiduciary. So a covered health plan is an employer-sponsored welfare plan which provides access to medical care for employees, their dependents directly through insurance or through reimbursement. Where you're going to see a lot of back and forth and the fighting that we're seeing right now is the definition of a covered service provider. And you have to go back to a law that's been around for some time, 408 B2. Got it right. Learning. And what that definition truly is. So covered service provider is really anybody that is working on behalf of your plan that's earning $1,000 or more in compensation. So these are the ones that we could come up with for this presentation, all under that bracket. And many in the industry are in agreement. Many are saying, oh, no, I don't need to report what I'm earning directly or indirectly. And we'll go over the details of what that compensation looks like.
And just to, if you do request a compensation disclosure from a vendor who says, no, I don't have to disclose that, I'm not a broker or a consultant, there is guidance that the Department of Labor issued on December 30th that instructs health plans to interpret this provision the same way it's interpreted in the 401k area. And they'll be issuing guidance down the road, but until then, they said, so you better be ready to justify, a position that someone is not a covered service provider if you don't list them as one, because we're going to use the same kind of criteria as we use in 401k. And in the 401k, pretty much everybody who works on the 401k is considered to be a covered service provider. So to be safe, to err on the side of caution would be to assume that all of your service providers to health plan are required to make this disclosure.
Can anybody think of any that we might be missing?
No, but what is point solutions?
Point solutions. So there's been this birth of point solutions, which you can embed into some plan designs. So if we think of self-funded health plans, really the goal of self-funding is to be able to understand the 70% of your health plan costs, which are equated to claims. We can fight back and forth over the administrative costs. Stop loss is typically fixed for the year, right? There's some negotiation strategies there. But what are we really doing to drive down claims costs? So we embed point solutions. So point solutions would be like a direct contracting program. Maybe we'll go to OSS and cut out the middleman and save money by doing so. Or there's advocacy programs like Highlight Health that now will help assist, depending on the demographics of the individual, what is a reasonable payment amount to go to certain facilities that tend to skirt the rules on some of the responsibilities. I won't knock any major health hospital systems that are fighting it out right now in central Pennsylvania, but all three of them as not-for-profits are required by law to treat certain people differently regardless of their insurance status. So point solutions are any of those vendors that fit into that matrix.
Also, what could be up there, if you have a wellness program, that would count, record keepers, if people that send COVID notices, basically anyone you can think of that doesn't work related to employee.
And to speak from the standpoint, I love that you gave me this.
Yeah.
So much fun.
At least something's working.
Yeah, right. From the insurance broker, consultant, advisor, consigliere, whatever you call them. While all of these folks make money and we live in a capitalistic society where you should be able to earn a living, pay your employees, right, and do good business. There are a lot of misaligned incentives that have existed in this world. So think about commission-based consultants or advisors. Where's my incentive to drive down your costs if you get a 30% increase and I get a 30% bonus for you getting that increase, right? So if I'm a fee-based consultant, there's a little bit more of an impetus to try to drive down costs, for instance. Now, to my point here, those people that exist in that space, they could get paid by the TPA, they could get paid by the PBM, they could get paid by stop loss. They could make money in a lot of different areas. So part of this law too is helping to expose that. Similar to what happened a little over a decade ago in the 401k space, where we had a lot of wealth managers that were frankly making money where they probably shouldn't have been making money. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, it is.
Have you seen those lawsuits?
I have. I'm part of some of them.
I know. So they're making what? There's direct compensation and indirect compensation. Proactive advisors, vendors should be sending you this information. Don't, have a knee-jerk reaction if they're not, but make sure that if you ask for it, they cough it up, for lack of better words. And in that, they should be reporting any earnings over $1,000 that they're making on your plan. And you as the fiduciary, unfortunately, have liability you put on your shoulders to be prudent and understand where the expenses are coming from your plan. So in direct compensation, contracted fees, commissions, finder's fees that they're getting paid, transactional fees, all transactional based compensation, any compensation that may be payable in connection with early termination or prepaid amounts that may be refunded. And then indirect compensation, these things that for a long time, since the passage of, I'm always going to push it, Sarbanes-Oxley.
Sarbanes-Oxley.
I called it Sarbanes-Oxley the other day. Yeah.
Gave him a little bit of Eastern European flair.
I just threw it out there. Which required the reporting of compensation on Schedule A 5500s. Has anybody filled out a 5500 form ever? They're so fun, right? To report compensation, and they should report indirect compensation like overrides and persistency payments. Not all advisors report that, and most say, oh, well, they're just paying that out in marketing and overhead at the carrier level. Well, your plan is involved in getting, in some instances, a very substantial payment. Could be, $20,000. It could be a couple $1 million. So we talk about misaligned incentives and people steering people to solutions that maybe aren't in the best interest of the plan or the plan participant. Indirect compensation could be like non-monetary compensation, like sports tickets, right? Box seats, things that add up over time. I think it was you that said, nobody does anything for free, right? They give you something, they expect something in return.
If you can sell it, it's compensation. So unless it's just a kind word or something, it's compensation. And just, one of the most common pushback that I've seen against this so far since this became a law is, service providers saying, well, we receive, every year a certain amount of money from a drug manufacturer or a carrier or whatever, but it isn't tied to any one client. It's for our entire business, and there's no way to really break it down. And if we did, we're sure that your plan, it wouldn't come to over $1,000. So already there's a tension. If there's no way to break it down, how are you sure of that? And if it goes firm-wide and it's on behalf of all your clients, then the response is, well, I need you to assign a pro rata share based on, split it up between your clients or do something, but I'm the one who has to make the disclosure. And at the end of the day, that's what you have to remember is you're going to have to disclose to the DOL that you got all of these disclosures and that you then reviewed them and looked at them so they were reasonable. So if a service provider gives you an excuse, you accepting that they're not the ones who are going to get in trouble, you are. And so as unfortunate as it feels, a lot of friends with our service providers. I like the broker for our plan, things like that. But you can't let that answer stand because it's you who has to then attest and be on the chopping block if something happens for enforcement. So I would push back against any sort of response like that.
And as we've learned, document.
Keep notes of everything in the file. And the DOL, they're pretty reasonable and they have a limited budget, and so they don't want to spend their time with people who are trying to comply. If you have a well-documented file that shows that you've done what you're supposed to do to comply, then you're not going to be their target. They're looking for the bad actors. And I think we have a slide that's going to discuss what happens about, what the attestation requirements are. So we'll get to that in a minute. But as long as you're trying and documenting your file that you are trying, I'm not trying to sound like, oh gosh, the DOL's coming for you. They're not going to, but they are trying to, clean things up a little bit in this area. And so they will go after people that aren't trying to comply at all.
So required disclosures when it comes to direct and indirect compensation. The description of services provided, all direct and indirect compensation, the manner in which they're receiving compensation, and whether or not they expect to be a planned fiduciary. What does that mean?
So 99% of the time they're gonna say no. But the question, are you a fiduciary? Are you because the reason you need to know that is, so a lot of TPAs in particular particular have certain fiduciary obligations when it comes to claims administration. If someone has fiduciary obligation and they're receiving certain amounts of compensation, then you have a next hurdle that you have to clear and make sure that what's happening is not a prohibited transaction. And spoiler alert, unfortunately, a lot of times what are happening in health plans are prohibited transactions. And to some extent, you almost can't help it at this point because there are carriers that own the facilities that pay the doctors. And so it's almost impossible not to pay someone who is benefiting from the transaction in another way. But as things go on, there will either be more carve-outs to the prohibited transactions, or some of the TPAs that are also insurance carriers are going to have to seek exemptions, which they've been really hesitant to do so far because they don't want a bad answer. But as they start to get sued for these things, they will have no choice but to see if they can seek an exemption to continue engaging in that activity.
So disclose the required information prior to the date the contract arrangement is entered, extended, or renewed. Disclose compensation changes within 60 days of being informed of the change. Correct inadvertent errors and omissions within 30 days of discovery. And respond to any written requests made by the client within 90 days. And if you renewed your plan after 12/27/2001, you needed to do these things yesterday.
And here's the rub. This is different than the gag clause that we just talked about. With this, they're supposed to give you disclosures. In a perfect world, you're just receiving these in your inbox and say, oh, this is for you to comply with the DOL. That's probably not happening with anybody. So you have to ask for them. And then if you don't get them, and you have to ask, you have to then inform them in writing. There are certain time periods for all of this, but they have like 30 days to correct. You have to inform them in writing, or you have to notify the DOL that they did not comply and give you the disclosure. The next step is that you actually do have to notify the DOL if they don't give you the disclosure. You also have to terminate contract. You can't continue working with that service provider if they don't make the disclosure. So even though the obligation is on them, the penalty is on you if they don't comply, if you don't report them. So it's very important, again, not just to keep your file, but to comply with DOL reporting requirements so that you're not the one left holding the bag if one of your service providers just refuses to disclose.
Did anybody see why some covered service providers are having that oh crap moment right now? Right? It's accountability at the end of the day. We should all be held accountable. Now I'm starting to sound like an attorney.
You
I
are.
know. So plan sponsor reporting.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
didn't realize that.
Go ahead.
And the thing is, just like with the gag clauses, once you get the information, just getting the disclosure isn't. Now, all of a sudden, you have to start thinking about this. So say, Justin gave an example a little while ago. Say you have a broker and you're just paying a 15% commission every year. And what you're getting in return is the same exact coverage, but it costs more every year. Well, now is the time to sit and think, okay, is this worth 15%? What am I getting in exchange for this 15% if I'm just renewing the same plan? I'm not getting any special discounts or things like that. You have to start thinking about that and think, is this a reasonable expense? And should I be paying this with plan assets? So again, it's not just getting the information, it's then using it to make decisions about whether or not these are reasonable. And if you decide they're not, or to shop around, see if there's anything better out there, but to try and use the information to save, $10 on the front end.
If anybody's interested in seeing what a sample or model fee disclosure document looks like, we can provide that to you. But thank you, Julie. He's absolutely right. It should list out what you're paying and then the services that are included, almost like a line item itemization. So if you're getting actuarial services, that should be included. If you're meetings, communications, what they're actually servicing within the account, what the expectation is regarding marketing or RFPs, that should all be laid out so you can say, okay, is this a value? And then the next step that's coming, like a freight train, and part of the reason that Brian from Clear Sage Advisory Services is here, them and other firms out there have done a tremendous job in benchmarking fees in the 401k space. Fee benchmarking now in the health and welfare advisory space is going to be a very big deal. Because if you ask 10 different consultants, they probably have 10 different prices.
So this is the first step. You can't benchmark until you get the, have some transparency, get the prices. But that's right, that's what will come next is benchmarking to figure out, is this at all reasonable? So it's gonna be very difficult in this interim period, the first few years. I don't know what's reasonable or what isn't, it's sort of like would I be mad if I had to pay this on my own personal finances? If so, maybe it's unreasonable. It's just gonna have to be sort of a thought process. But as long as you engage in the thought process for now and do the things you're supposed to do, that should be sufficient to comply with your own fiduciary obligations. But, as we're at the sort of beginning stages of having the information to make these decisions.
So plan sponsor reporting, plan sponsors must report information to the, HHS. Who knows what that stands for? Jamie Levy. There we go. Josh,
Who's first?
Miss Jamie up front.
Miss Jamie up front.
So, DOL and Treasury, you must report premium and rebates, federal healthcare spend, top 50 brand drugs most frequently dispensed, the amount spent for those 50 prescription drugs with the greatest prior you plan you could spend, and then annual amount spent on 50 most costly prescription drugs by total plan coverage spend. Is anybody getting this data right now and has it ready to access? One person.
Won't, won't.
I'm impressed with the one
I'm
person.
actually, yeah. That's awesome. That's great. So being able to understand where the expenses are. Why is this important? Well, I'm a recovering drug rep. I called on 300 doctors in central Pennsylvania for a drug company, and I sold a $2.5 billion a year drug that had like 8 generic alternatives and 10 other competitors in its brand class, and it costs $300 a month, right? So we're not dictating what should or should not be prescribed to an individual, but when you have certain medications that find their way on a plan like Duexis, which is Hepcid combined with ibuprofen, which you can both buy over the counter for like really cheap, and it hits a plan for $2,000 a month as a prescription, that's a problem, right? Or certain rebatable drugs, are you getting those rebates back, which are due to you for, frankly, overpaying? That's what a rebate is. You overpay to get a portion of your money back. It is the PBM keeping a portion of that money.
And is your TPA keeping the rest of it? Because almost every ASO I've seen, at least, they just unilaterally announce that they'll be keeping the remainder of any rebate that's received, which is something you might want to push back against now that you get the disclosure of how much that rebate is. It might be unreasonable. Why wouldn't that come back to you if it's the cost you're paying? And those are the sort of things now that the gag clauses are removed, you can sort of put some thought to, like, why would they get just that? What do they do to earn this? It's our money. So I think that those are the sort of things that are going to start happening. And as Justin said, just knowing the 15 most frequently dispensed drugs allows you as an employer, a plan sponsor, or a consultant to say, we can offer this drug, which does the same exact thing as the generic, and it you can offer an incentive to get employees to, ask their doctors for this, or ask that we only be prescribed this. You can, tier drugs, but there's ways to get costs under control once you have a better picture of what you're spending the money on.
So we finally figured out that the brain's connected to the body. Mental health is equally as important as physical health. That's another Josh Spivak quote. I gotta give him credit where credit's due. So mental health parity is a big deal. It's been around for a long time, but there's some additional requirements under these recent laws that you have to take a look at as a plan sponsor and as a prudent fiduciary. Julie, do you want to share a little bit on mental health parity?
So this has been a really, Congress is most interested in this area. We've seen the mental health issues there, so we can see why, but no, this is like the area where our lawmakers are most interested. So EPSA is focused on this, but it's also a really amorphous area to focus on. It says, if you offer mental health services under your health plan, which you don't have to still. So there isn't really a full recognition that your mind is part of the health system because you can exclude it entirely. But if you're going to include it, you have to be equal with what you provide for mental health coverage as physical health coverage. So it's easy to sort of at the beginning to say, oh, well, you can't require me to have a pre-authorization to go, for an inpatient stay at a mental health or substance abuse clinic because you don't require that for an inpatient stay in the hospital for, if I'm having a procedure done. So those are the easy fixes. Now, what they're trying to do is quantitative comparisons, which are always good, but non-quantitative. So really comparing quality and access and things that are more difficult to quantify. And just as a personal anecdote, one of the things that comes up a lot and has come up in my own family is if you have a child that requires, the doctor says, I think you should bring the child to see a psychologist. Finding a psychologist in network can be very difficult. A child psychologist that's accepting new patients, it can be like finding the holy grail, basically. And, finding someone who doesn't have, a 0.13 complaints with health grades or something like that. And if that's the only in-network choice, well, do you really have a choice? Is that really equal to the 5,000 professionals you can find if your child needs a pediatrician or something? So things like that are starting to become a focus to actually have a network that's capable of doing this. And in lots of areas, there are no mental health professionals, or there's a real lack of mental health professionals. And so plans are going to have to be really creative and make sure that telehealth is on the menu going forward. Because one of the things the pandemic has shown is that telehealth is definitely a viable model for mental health visits. Is it appropriate in all time for all people? No, but does it work? Yeah, and is it certainly better than nothing? And if you live in an area where there are no mental health professionals, then telehealth might be one of the only solutions to that. So, this is the non-qualitative comparisons are more difficult, but the non-quantitative, are more difficult, but they're what really bring you to actual parity, actual equality. And unfortunately, the DOL just published its report on this. And I think that nobody was in compliance, not one employer that they tried to follow up with in compliance. And they followed up with about 400 and some odd employers to do this report. They do an annual report to Congress. And this is the first year that these quantitative and non-quantitative limitations were supposed to be, a report was supposed to be created. So not one, as I said, not one employer was in compliance. And the main reason was that employers did not realize that this was their responsibility. And they thought that this was something that if they're in a fully insured plan, the carrier would do, or if they're in a self-insured plan that the TPA would do. Well, that is what's going to happen now, probably, but you have to, have a dialogue about it and discuss it with them. And like in the other areas, if you're in a self-funded plan, the CPAs are going to monetize this as well, and it'll cost you money to get this report. And the level of detail you want will be cost specific. So it's another area that might cost money, but it's something that has to be done. And this is a definite enforcement priority for ABSA.
Kristen.
Yeah, so for mental health, do you see that shaping FMLA or ABA in any way? Do you see changes to that in the future?
You'd think there would be, but the fact that mental health parity is limited right now, health plans, it doesn't even account for short-term disability or long-term disability.
Right.
I don't think there's been an actual push for true parity. Is that in the cards down the road? Yes, but this is a very slow-moving Congress, so I don't see anything like that in the next 5 years.
Thank you.
So most vendors, if you ask, they should be able to produce something, not all. Some fail miserably. There's also a self-reporting tool available to you on the DOL website. But you would need to invest probably at least 40 hours in working with your vendors to be able to produce the report that they want. So like Julie had shared, hopefully here in the near future, everybody will include it. And hopefully not charge an arm and a leg to be able to include something that should be standard. I see Max struck out complacency and put liability. Nice. So the cost of a prohibited transaction. Now, it's not the employer that's liable. They are to an extent, but the person that's making the decisions in the driver's seat, they can be personally liable now. Accurate statement?
Semi-accurate.
Okay.
The second part, yes. You can be held personally liable if you're named fiduciary, but the employer is also liable. The plan sponsor is liable. So it's sort of joint liability.
So the DOL can enforce civil monetary penalties under ERISA section 502. What is that?
So those penalties can range up to the cost of whatever the error was, but there can also be an additional 20% tagged on as a penalty charge. And there can also, in addition to civil money penalties, if the Department of Labor and EBSA think that violations are bad enough, they can refer it to the for criminal enforcement. And believe it or not, there are criminal sanctions available under ERISA. That doesn't happen very often. You really have to be that usually happens more in the ESOP area and employee stock ownership plans and things like that. It's very rare to see people get, criminally prosecuted for ERISA violations. But if, rampant fraud is uncovered during any of the disclosures selection, then it's certainly a possibility. I think it's more likely if that were to happen, anyone facing criminal penalties, it wouldn't be an employer unless they were really, complicit with their own PDM and ASO providers.
They're getting like kickbacks or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So there's a potential for a 50% tax under IRC section 4975, which could go as high as 100% of fiduciaries do not act in a timely manner. And then the potential for a class action lawsuit, which I know a class action attorney.
That's right, and that's obviously the big worry that everyone has, and I'm a plaintiff's attorney in my firm, we bring class action lawsuits on behalf of classes of plans or plaintiffs that are seeking to, vindicate their rights, and it's obviously very expensive for an employer, and anything that can be done to minimize the risk of a class action lawsuit is desirable. I think that and unfortunately, the way these laws have been passed, the class action, the people that are facing the front lines of the defendants for these new wave of class actions aren't going to be TBAs, it's going to be employers. And this is why it's the employers that have been given all the tools and all the requirements to do the attestations, is because at the end of the day, the employer is being held ultimately, of the plan sponsors being held as the ultimate responsible party. And that's the party that will be liable. Now, does that mean that if you're sued because of something that your TPA did, that you don't have any recourse? No, it doesn't mean that. But unfortunately, most ASO agreements have mandatory arbitration clauses. So it's not like you can then, sue them in district court. That has to be handled through a private arbitration. There's a lot of complicating factors that leave the employer as the one, sitting in the hot seat.
Have the lawsuits begun yet?
Yes, they have, and they began before these laws passed, to be honest. Some of us were already interested in this area and were starting to bring lawsuits, and the DOL brought some. So there was a pretty, famous case, Chimes via Costa, and I say famous, in the ERISA world, but it was the DOL going after an employer for failing to monitor. And we've actually, my colleague Karen and I have written an article about the duty to monitor service providers, and before these laws passed, and how, this duty was really difficult to comply with, and not complying with it meant that you could be sued by the DOL. And there's several instances of the DOL doing this. Now that these tools are here, we think that's going to become much more likely, and that the main cause of action that we'll be seeing in class actions are failure to monitor.
All right, another pop quiz. ASO. Does anybody know what ASO stands for?
Oh, I said it 50 times. I'm so sorry.
All right, Administrative Services Agreement. Let that one go. Josh, you're not allowed to answer.
I just want to scratch a lottery.
So Julie puts out a lot of great information. You can look her up and find quite a few blogs that she's penned and some of her literature. We've been really excited to be able to work in conjunction with Berger Montag and see what they're doing in real time with these very relevant laws that have passed. We wanted to leave enough time for some Q&A and really get into any questions that you have, because we covered a lot of material here across the board. And there's probably some details or questions that you have. So can we open it up to Q&A? Is anybody scared?
So until someone raises their hand, I'm just talking and fill the void. So an ASO, as Justin said, Administrative Services Agreement or Administrative Services Only. This is when you're in a self-funded plan and you hire a carrier to administer claims. And this is where a big part of our focus is at Berger Montag, because this is where a lot of the biggest problems emerge. And we keep throwing around. Does anyone know what a prohibited transaction is? This is worthy. Anyone? Okay. A prohibited transaction under ERISA. This is a really big deal because this is all geared to root this out. Is any transaction that isn't done solely for the benefit of the plan, it can, and if you're self-dealing, meaning if you benefit from the transaction, it's extra bad. So first of all, the result of any failure to have disclosures, these compensation disclosures that we spoke about, the DOL has said, if no disclosure is made, then it is automatically a prohibited transaction. What that means is that you cannot be part of it because that violates ERISA and it puts your fiduciary duty, you're violating it. What you'll find out, unfortunately, when you get a lot of this information is that there are a lot of prohibited transactions going on inside of your health plan, especially if you're in a self-funded plan, because an insurance carrier is making decisions that sometimes benefit them financially. And that is the quintessential definition of a prohibited transaction. They are entitled to seek an exemption from the Department of Labor if they think it's worthy. And there are a list of exemptions that are statutory, and then another businesses all the time write and ask permission for an exemption, and it's either granted or not. The reason that carriers haven't done this is because doing so would jeopardize the business model, because there's lots of prohibited transactions that occur if you have an insurance carrier as your third-party administrator. And if they get a bad ruling from the DOL, that would really jeopardize the entire practice. But a few things that commonly occur that, here's one to look out for. If there's something in your agreement that allows the insurance company to offset, there's a lot of overpayments that occur in your plan. If you have all the time. And I'm not exactly sure why. There's a variety of reasons. But one of the things that happens is that the TPA or the carrier is supposed to go after overpayments, because you as a plan sponsor have an obligation to go after overpayments. Well, some plans have a provision in them that say, if we realize that, we've overpaid a doctor and then someone in your plan is going to that same doctor, we'll cover the claim, but then we'll withhold the amount they owe us from the payment. Well, historically, that has left a participant with a covered claim and a bill. So they've covered the whole thing, but because they withhold a portion of the money, the doctor still has, say, $500 unpaid on your bill, and they can balance bill you. So this has been a focus that we've been particularly interested in, but that's just one of the sort of things that occurs inside of these administrative service agreements that end up inuring to the benefit of a party that is not planned. And anything that results in a benefit outside the plan is a
Overpayment recoupment fees. They're rampant.
nightmare.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
I know Mike has a question.
sorry.
Go
Chrissy.
ahead, Mike, you go first.
A question about benchmarking fees. How soon you think that might happen? And before it becomes more common, does a plan fiduciary have a responsibility, if they've been in a plan for a long time, to go out and shop that plan and figure out if there's a better option, better costs out there for the plan?
I'll give my advisor opinion and then you can give the attorney opinion. So I let me steal a quote from Ted Lasso, and I use it way too much. The truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. Yes, you do have a responsibility to go out and market your plan, in my opinion. And I would say that to any client that we have as well. We should be held accountable, and you should be doing a comparison. And everything shouldn't be based alone on cost. But now we should have an understanding of what you're paying for and what you're getting. As far as your question regarding benchmarking and fees, there have been folks in the industry that have been collecting data, at least on a regional basis. Some national data exists to be able to have a comparison. But right now we see that as a more necessary niche service that's being provided. And there's some folks out there that are doing it really well to help people be able to understand. So I had a major company up the road here reach out the other week, and we were able to refer them to somebody because they feel it necessary based on this to benchmark their fees with a disinterested third party.
And from a legal perspective, it makes all kinds of sense to shop around and to get RFPs from various service providers, particularly if there's someone you've been with for a long time and you're not sure if you're getting a real return or investment there. And DOL actually in their guidance suggests that you do issue RFPs as part of the responsible fiduciary standard. So yeah, I agree with that.
Christie?
So you mentioned 15% as the fee that we're potentially paying and whether or not we're getting the value for that 15%. So what would be the top 3 things that you believe we should be receiving that demonstrates that 15% is valuable?
That's a great
It
question.
is a fantastic question. And I'm going to give you an attorney response. Well, it depends. So it depends on what they've been hired to do, right? So if you're paying 15% and it's a multi-million-dollar plan, it's fully insured, and I'm disclosing everything, am I just doing an RFP for you every couple of years or on an annual basis for stop loss or your health plan every 3 years for your ancillary? I think first and foremost, service. We see a lot of people that don't service their accounts. And what does service mean? The ability to pick up the phone and have a discussion regarding any number of issues that occur, as well as managing those vendors appropriately and not manage them from the perspective of our friends, but managing it as not a fiduciary, but acting like a fiduciary for your plan. Doing their due diligence and doing what I'll say is an honest RFP. Time and time again, we find a lot of consultants are pushing towards a certain carrier or block of business because of overrides and persistency payments. Hopefully the fee disclosures really cast a light on people getting paid where they shouldn't be paid. And then there's a list of other services that I would say, just depending on the client, that would be valuable. Actuarial reporting, budgeting, forecasting, depending on the needs of the employer.
So I think those are all great things, and I agree with Justin, there is probably no set thing that you get in return for that. But I guess the red flags is what I would look for as a lawyer. A red flag would be that nothing changes ever every year and you're paying the same amount. How will you justify? You have to be able to say, what will I say? If the Department of Labor says to me, what am I getting for this? And what are you getting for it? Make the broker explain it. Like, why does it cost this much for me to get the same thing? Why can't I just renew it? Cut out the middleman. And you need to be able to provide, you need to be comfortable with the response you get because you'll have to provide it elsewhere. So it's more of a, like the standard for pornography. I'll know it when I see it, you might be getting value that you're not aware of. And when a broker explains it, you think, oh, this is great. If a broker says, well, I'm the only person that's able to get a contract that allows you into the network for this, hospital system that you said you must have, then that's great. Or if you have a broker that is willing to pick up the phone and intervene on your behalf with the carrier all the time, that's really great. So there are lots of things that brokers do that provide value, but there are, bad brokers out there. So it's just separating the wheat from the chaff. And it's basically, if you what you want is an explanation that you feel comfortable giving to an authority figure. And if you feel comfortable, then it's probably a good explanation. If you're nervous that the comfortable leaves you is lacking, then go with your instinct. And that's a good time to shop around and do our, maybe you can get a better value.
Here's a good thought. Is this disclosable or not disclosable? And before we leave, we'll tell you, I don't think we formally said what you need to attest to by the end of the year. That just popped in my head, so we'll hit that. But say I'm providing an benefits administration system, and my cost as a broker is 25 cents per member per month, but I'm charging them $4 per member per month. Do I need to disclose that?
Absolutely. That's compensation. That's definitely compensation.
That's a common. So from an attestation perspective, what you need to attest to, I'm sorry, was there a question?
It was just a follow-up comment.
please
I
do.
agree with you. I have a standout broker that I've worked with in the past, and he absolutely is an advocate. So anytime there's a discrepancy with claim coding or just getting the needed prescription, he jumps in right away and takes it and escalates it in a way that I haven't seen many others do. So I don't know if it was a diamond in the rough or is that
Yeah, no,
something
he's a
that
diamond in the rough, and that's what you keep. The
Yeah.
broker that will actually go to bat for you, like intervene on your behalf. And Justin mentioned that he's a recovering drug rep. I am a recovering insurance coverage attorney on behalf of the insurance company. And so I am fully aware, and I apologize, I am fully aware that brokers, many brokers hold themselves out as being your representative, and really they're representing the insurer whose product they're placing. And so it's a very dicey area, and it's important to make sure that you're comfortable with your broker and that you feel like they actually represent you.
The death of I can say this, the old male pale and stale way of doing advising where we just, sign your renewal and go away has left. The rise of the advisor, that's what we're seeing now. And I think that happened in the 401k space as well over a decade ago. And that's the type of value that you look for, which is awesome.
So what is I think you're about to say, but what's the timeline, like, this is due at the end of the year? Is it on plan renewal? What's the time frame?
So
Well, so the good news is that there are only a few things due this year. The bad news is that we only covered like 3 parts of this new law, and there are a bunch more things that come into effect next year and the year after. However, for the end of this year, what is required is an attestation that you have the gap clauses removed from your administrative service agreements with your third-party administrators. Or with gap clauses removed from all your service provider contracts, because your PBM contract will have them as well, and there might be others. So they all have to be reviewed. And again, we put together a list of some of the more common ones because they're not always as obvious as you might think. Anytime you come to an area in a contract that prevents you from knowing information, consider that a gap clause and push back and say, I need this removed because this violates ERISA under the Consolidated Appropriations Act. So you've got the gap clause removal, the compensation disclosures from service providers. You have to attest that those were all received at the end of the year. And so those are the two main, those are only 2 attestations, which is good, but you should be like already collecting disclosures of compensation disclosures if you haven't done so. And the gap clause removals are already late, but it doesn't matter because the DOL is also busy. And so as long as they're ready this year, you'll be fine. Also, by the end of this year, you need to have the list of that Justin put up of the 50 most commonly prescribed drugs and what your overall pharmacy costs are. And that's something that your vendors should help you pull together.
question?
How do you feel being in a consortium changes any of those responsibilities?
Well, not all captives or consortiums are that captivating. It really, it depends. They should be providing the same disclosures that any other vendor would as a covered service provider. They should be disclosing if they have embedded solutions, the fees that are made off of the plans there as well. Personally, I would look at any captive or consortium as just another stop loss market. I'm not going to get married to them, and they change. So one of the largest ones in the country just got bought by private equity. Anytime private equity steps into our space, we need to get the H out, mainly because they're looking for anywhere from 40 to 60% ROI on that investment. And how are they going to get that? Right? So there's some that we like, and we can talk offline about that, but there's some that their accounting is really funky. And we hired an actuary recently, and she can confirm that. So, yeah.
But I would say the biggest takeaway from this is don't let that create a false sense of complacency, because they still, that doesn't absolve you. You're still the one who has duty. You have duty to monitor them and review their work. Even if they're monitoring everyone else, you have to monitor them and make sure that they're doing it properly.
Jen?
So is there a limit in terms of like employee size or even like the benefit plan? Okay.
No.
So you got 1 employee, you have.
If you offer a health plan, you're a fiduciary. So it's not like the ACA laws with applicable to large employers, 50 full-time equivalents or more.
Even
Which-
grandfathered plans
yeah.
have to follow these new rules. This applies to everybody across the board. And there are similar companion rules for the individual marketplace. They obviously have different reporting requirements and they're more on the actual provider, the carriers themselves. But the similar rules have passed there, and similar rules have passed regarding Medicare Advantage plans and things like that. It applies across the board.
And as a follow-up to that, sorry. So for the information that you're receiving from the different plans and you're reviewing that, is our responsibility just to go about looking at the benchmarking in terms of, does this align with industry averages? Or is it getting down to like, we need to be reviewing, we're describing kind of specific transactions where we have a liability and responsibility to view each and every visit that an employee has made to the provider and ensure that that is lining up with the benchmarks and the published rates.
It's not that advanced yet. You do need to make a good faith effort in requesting direct compensation from the vendors. The requirements will become more stringent, we assume, or at least we're expecting as time goes on understanding how the plan is operating. So I use the analogy, I just wrote this in a blog. Historically, you didn't care how the watch worked. You just wanted to know that it told time. Now, unfortunately, they're making you understand how the watch works at a bigger level. So as benchmarking becomes more available, I don't want to say it's the standard right now, there you will be required to benchmark towards your peers. And I may be speaking out of school there. Is that a requirement now? Benchmarking?
No, but I would say more to the question you had about individual review of each claim. That's not a requirement, but what is a requirement is making sure somebody is reviewing claims properly. So you already have a service provider that should be doing this. You know, it's either the carrier or it's the, the TPA. And people in a fully insured plans shouldn't feel like they don't have this responsibility, because you do, unfortunately. It's for everybody. And the question is, are the carriers doing their due diligence, the TPAs, and making sure that they're not overpaying? And when we look, you can look for 5 minutes and see that claims are paid that aren't even covered under the plans or the policies that are issued, that, someone they'll pay for 2 hysterectomies on the same day on the same person. Really like low hanging fruit that should be caught by a diligent TPA. And so unfortunately, or a diligent, insurance carrier. So right now, I would say the role is making sure that your carrier or TPA is being responsible in reviewing their own, what they're doing. And, you'll see it, you can look at your agreements and it'll say things like, the TPA will at their own discretion review claims. Well, that might not be okay going forward. There is no discretion. You have to review them and make sure that they're paid properly. And so those are the kind of provisions going forward that you're going to want to renegotiate in your administrative service agreement or your contracts with carriers, is that they have to make sure that they are paying claims properly and review themselves. And then another question that's going to come down the road is, a lot of the overpayment recovery services that you're paying for are them paying for their own mistakes. They're getting paid to fix the mistakes they make. And so is that reasonable? Is it reasonable that they get to keep 30% of an overage that they pay when they recover it? Or when their subsidiary or affiliate recovers it? You've got United and Optum. United overpays something by $50,000. Optum negotiates it down $50,000. And then keeps $15,000, which goes back into the Optum United pot. Is that fair? I don't know. I don't think it is, but these are the issues that are going to emerge when people start reviewing their claims data.
Going back to Christy's point real quick about those top 3, and shame on me for not saying this, the biggest one should probably be education. This is such a broad industry. There's specialists in every aspect of health and welfare benefits, from your PBM to your TPA. You should be getting an education every time you talk with your broker.
You need an acronym advisor too.
Fun story, when I was dating Kim, and some of my wife, I told her about a voluntary STD plan that we implemented. She's like, what? Does anybody know what STD stands for in our world? Right here, Josh, that one right there. She gets a ticket. Yes.
You got 3 more.
Josh, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to, a question and also just make a comment when, you're talking about claims and claim review. One of the big things that we're seeing is employers, specifically they're self-insured, looking at the data, right? So a lot of times you see now, the fox is watching the hen house. So when there's claims that fall outside of the box are large, if you're running on a self-funded plan, whether it's the Blue Cross or an independent TPA, before paying that claim, you don't have to pay that claim right away. Have it, take a look at it. Either get a professional and take a look. This is not a plug for us. This is work that we do, but have a look at those claims because you'll be very surprised what's oftentimes is spent. So we're seeing employers across the country, taking this approach. We had one just as an example. It was a 7-figure claim and somebody was in a hospital for 19 hours.
And
They went to WellSpan, no. Joking.
Like freely, they're paying that claim freely, you want to have a look at it. You have a right as a plan sponsor of the fiduciary to look at it, and make sure it's right. It might be right, it might be wrong, but those types of in-depth reviews.
And this is a great point that Josh makes, is, first of all, like, something like 4 out of 5 bills that are received from a hospital have something wrong. 80%, there's always a mistake. They're almost always contain a mistake. Also, the amount that's reflected on that initial bill is not the amount that you're supposed to pay. And or usually is not the amount that you need to pay. And so there are things that your TPAs should be doing that they're not doing when one of your participants goes to a hospital. And that, you could be checking for to make sure that if the hospital has any discount programs based on your income or things like that, that should be looked at. There are ways to save money in plans that are not being utilized by the people you pay to save you money right now. And so because you don't know about them yet, there's no expectation that by the end of this year, you're all experts in health insurance law and the fire and we're all exactly what you're owed. That's just can't be like that. It's very opaque and complicated. But as you peel the layers back and start getting this information, you'll see things like, why are we paying $50,000, and that's my favorite figure, as you can tell, $50,000 for C-sections at this hospital, and then this hospital up the street, you can get the same thing, $30,000. Maybe we should only have people go to that hospital, or recommend people go to that hospital, or incentivize people. But there are simple things you can do like that. You can just look at obvious discrepancies. So I agree with Josh that your current service providers might not be incentivized right now to point out to you the mistakes that they've been letting slide or making. And so it might require hiring an independent service provider who's sort of on your side. It's on your side of the table and is saying, here's what's wrong, here are some easy fixes. Or when it comes to like a particularly large claim, hiring someone just to review that claim and make sure this is something that is really the way it should be, and that you want to set this precedent going forward, that this is how you'll pay large claims.
I think we're at time. Yeah. Hey, listen, thank you so much for having us here. It's a pleasure to be back, and we appreciate the opportunity here to answer any questions or just be a resident BS detector if you need one.
Thank you, Justin, Joel, and